For the first time in history, the use of air power became a significant part of warfare with World War I. Aircraft in World War I were primitive and poorly designed at first. Military planners were uncertain about the usefulness of airplanes. Planes were fragile, made mostly of cloth and wood. On the other hand, they were able to cover large areas and had a great freedom of movement. They could also fly behind enemy lines. During the war, airplanes were used for scouting, reconnaissance, dogfighting, and bombing. Scouting was done mostly in the beginnings of the war. Early World War I pilots would take things with them in their planes as they headed into battle, such as chains and bricks, which they would attempt to fling at enemy aircraft. Eventually, they carried pistols and rifles. As the pilots quickly found out, shooting at a moving target through a maze of wires, struts, and whirling propellers was tricky business. The fire often hit parts of his own aircraft. The innovation of a synchronized machine gun that could be fired through the propeller without damaging it soon resolved this issue. Airplanes were a powerful reconnaissance tool. The Battle of the Marne, for example, was started because an Allied pilot noticed a 50-mile wide gap in German lines. The pilot quickly notified Allied commanders on the ground, and they flanked two German armies on each side. The battle, however, ended in a stalemate. Bombs were still a primitive technology. When a formation of aircraft would approach a city, usually at night, the searchlights would catch them in their beams. Air raid sirens would wail, and citizens would flock to their basements. There was actually very little danger from the bombs themselves, as they were more of a nuisance than a hazard. At the dawn of the war, Germany, France, and Britain had all been hard at work establishing a fleet of aircraft that could be used for combat. By this time, the number of military aircraft in the world was only around 1,000. America relied heavily on France for its aviation program. In 1916, 7 Americans formed a fighter aircraft squadron which would become one of the most famous and romanticized of all air units. They called themselves Escadrille Americaine. Later, the name was changed to Escadrille Lafayette in honor of the French general and hero of the American Revolution. France provided the squadron with aircraft and other necessary equipment. All the pilots were American volunteers serving under the French flag. The Escadrille Lafayette contributed to an increasing tension between Germany and the United States. Soon, the Escadrille Lafayette had captured the heart of America. On May 18, 1916, it downed its first enemy aircraft. Other Americans serving in France were transferred to the squadron. Among these was Raoul Loufberry. When the United States had entered the war by April of 1917, they were poorly prepared to fight a war in the air. With fewer than 250 aircraft, it took the Army Air Service a full year to get units into action. All of the American pilots serving in the war had been trained and were flying in France, using French-built aircraft. In fact, by the end of the war, not a single aircraft manufactured in America had flown into combat because America was so ill-prepared for aviation. This didn't stop the Allies from achieving full aerial supremacy by September of 1918, however.
During World War I, there was a mass realization of the necessity of advances in aviation technology. Until the war, planes were only used for reconnaissance and not much more. Throughout the war, dogfights would break out between planes. This was difficult to engage in because each plane needed a pilot who then had to use a separate gun to shoot, or have another passenger who would act as the gunner. Planes were later equipped with mounted machine guns for the passenger, but the problem still persisted that the pilot could hardly aim, shoot, and fly at the same time. The idea for a mounted machine gun was proposed for the front of the plane, but being placed behind the propellers, it would shoot itself down. So they were mounted over the propeller or around it until the spring of 1915, when the synchronizer gear was designed by a French engineer named Raymond Saulnier. This gear regulated the gun's fire so that it would fire and enable bullets to pass in between the blades of the propellers. But this gear was not exactly new. It was a German patent, and the Swedes had dabbled in the idea as well. Eventually, due to its downed aircrafts and the spread of new engineering, the new device was spread between all of the main powers. Another form of air offense that went under development during World War I was the use of bombing. The Central Powers built a force around the Zeppelin airships, giant blimps used for bombing. One of the first planes designed for bombing was built by the French, called the Voisin, which was a pusher biplane built with an aluminum frame, demonstrating the experimentation in aircraft design and construction materials. But bombers were slower and required thicker plating to protect themselves from enemy fire. Later, the triplane was introduced, made famous by the Red Baron. With shorter, stubbier wings, it allowed for greater maneuverability and a higher ascendance rate. Three planes of the era were the Handley-Page bomber, the Sopwith-Pup, and the Sopwith triplane. The Handley-Page bomber was a twin-engine bomber biplane built by Handley-Page Aircraft Firm and was the principal heavy bomber of the Royal Air Force by the end of World War I. The Sopwith-Pup appeared in 1916 at the time when the Allies were coming up against what would be known as the Fokker Scourge. It allowed air supremacy by Germany and her allies for a time. The Sopwith triplane, dubbed the Triple Hound by her pilots, was a three-winged plane that also had shorter and stubbier wings, and it was built upon the success of the Sopwith-Pup.
The French fitted a plane with a machine gun firing through the propeller arc. It was a devastating weapon. Germany discovered the secret and built the world's first real fighter, the deadly Fokker Eindecker. The Fokker Scourge began. France answered with the agile Nieuport, and the war in the air became a race for technical superiority.
Pilots, innovators, and notable individuals. The pilots of World War I were a special breed of individuals. They had to be fearless, relentless, focused, driven, and pioneering. Due to the primitive design of the aircraft, flying was a dangerous business. Factor in the danger of combat itself, and being a World War I pilot was no less hazardous than being an infantryman in the trenches. The average life expectancy for a combat pilot was 40 to 60 hours of flight time. Death usually came in two forms for the pilot: by fire or falling from great height. Parachutes did not exist, and many pilots preferred to leap from their flaming aircraft than burn to death in their tiny cockpits. Something else that killed pilots was their being knocked unconscious by fumes emitted by the crude gasoline engines. In the beginning of the war, there was a chivalry between the pilots of both sides. They saw each other as brothers, adventurers. Opposing pilots would pass each other with a friendly wave or salute. Combat pilots became heroes. Fighting their own individual battles high above the mud, the media depicted them as modern-day knights jousting for the skies. In order for a pilot to be considered an ace, he must have at least 5 confirmed combat kills and/or victories. In order for the victory to be official, there must be witnesses, and the enemy must not be shot behind enemy lines. Manfred von Richthofen is perhaps one of the most famous pilots during World War I. Known also as the Red Baron, Richthofen had 80 confirmed victories during the war, including more that were never officially validated. Oswald Bulk is widely regarded as one of the greatest German flyers. He was honored by the British as our brave and chivalrous foe. Ren Fonck was an outstanding French ace with 75 confirmed victories. Edward Mannock was a British ace with 73 confirmed victories, although was actually blind in one eye. Charles Nungesser was a French ace with 45 victories, and he is regarded to have expressed an indomitable energy in the sky. Billy Bishop was a Canadian ace with a relentless hatred of Germans, and he scored 72 victories. Raoul Luftberry was the third-ranking American ace with 17 confirmed victories. He transferred to the U.S. Air Service from Lafayette Escadrille. Before the war, he gained flying experience by working as a stunt pilot in China. Frank Balloon